4 barrels fire at once. In a single second, over 50 shells scream into the sky. The thunder is so intense the earth literally shakes beneath your feet, even 100 yards away. A low-flying ground attack jet, seemingly untouchable a moment ago, disintegrates in midair before it can even begin to maneuver. This is the Shilka, a legendary Soviet self-propelled anti-aircraft gun designed with one goal: to make the enemy fear the ground itself. But why did Soviet engineers take a gamble, choosing a small caliber over raw power? To understand that, we have to go back to the 1950s, when a battle was unfolding in the skies that you won't find in most textbooks. In the mid-50s, the Soviet Union faced a mockingly simple NATO tactic. Western pilots began flying at ultra-low altitudes, literally skimming the treetops. The logic was brutal. Formidable Soviet missiles were great at swatting targets out of the stratosphere, but they had a quote _0 _ at low altitudes. Radars simply couldn't lock onto a jet screaming across the deck fast enough. What could the USSR fire back with? At the time, almost nothing effective. The aging ZSU-57-2 was a failure in this new era, only 240 rounds per minute and zero automation. It lacked its own radar, meaning crews had to aim by eye, a hopeless task against jet speeds. Even 14.5mm machine guns fell short, lacking the stopping power to punch through armored strike aircraft. The Soviet army was effectively defenseless against low-altitude threats at the height of the Cold War. A solution was needed immediately. In 1957, development began on 2 ambitious projects, the Shilka and its primary rival, the Yenisei. Many mistakenly believed the Shilka and Yenisei were simple competitors, but the reality was much more strategic. The Shilka was designed to protect infantry at low altitudes, while the Yenisei was built for tank divisions, targeting threats up to 3 kilometers. The military intended for them to complement each other, but the 1961 comparative trials flipped the script. The Shilka weighed only 19 tons and was incredibly mobile, while the 28-ton Yenisei proved too heavy and cumbersome for motorized infantry units. Then came the paradox. At an altitude of 2 kilometers, the Yenisei was king, boasting a nearly 40% hit probability, while the Shilka remained powerless. But once the ceiling dropped to 200 to 500 meters, the exact zone where NATO jets operated, the Shilka became twice as effective as its more powerful brother. In 1962, the unexpected happened. Soviet command officially adopted the Shilka, ordering an immediate halt to all work on the Yenisei. The logic behind this decision was ironclad and pragmatic. At the time, the Soviet Union was aggressively developing surface-to-air missile systems that already dominated medium and high altitudes. The Yenisei, with its 3-kilometer ceiling, was stepping into someone else's territory, becoming a redundant link in the defensive chain. Only the Shilka could plug the lethal gap right above the deck, where missiles were useless. Hunting at ultra-low altitudes didn't require heavy-caliber rounds. It required extreme rate of fire, the ability to literally saturate the sky with metal in a heartbeat. The designers knew that the 23mm cannon was a painful compromise, as its shells could barely penetrate the armor of ground vehicles. However, to transform the airspace into a guaranteed kill zone, it was the perfect choice. Adoption in 1962 didn't mean the machine was ready for a real fight. On the contrary, the first production models were a nightmare for testers and engineers alike. Imagine this. You pull the trigger, expecting a devastating wall of fire, but instead, the guns fall silent after the first short burst. The main culprit was jamming. Spent casings constantly clogged the mechanism, paralyzing the unit at the most critical moment. The barrels overheated so rapidly they required forced liquid cooling, and the complex electronics inside the cramped hull failed from the slightest vibration of the tracks. During those years, the Shilka was openly called, quote, one, and many doubted its future. Engineers worked in a state of constant emergency, fixing hundreds of defects on the fly. They had to do more than just build a self-propelled gun. They had to make 4 temperamental barrels operate with the precision of a single chronometer. It wasn't until 1964, after thousands of rounds expended on firing ranges and a complete redesign of the ammunition feed system, that the machine finally achieved its legendary reliability. The anti-aircraft harvester learned to spit lead without pause, and the updated cooling system allowed for sustained long bursts without the risk of the guns melting. At that moment, the Shilka transformed from a glitchy prototype into a real-world weapon capable of grinding enemy aviation on an industrial scale. The heart of the Shilka was its radar instrument complex, unique for its time. Before its arrival, anti-aircraft gunners worked much like they did in World War I, You had to visually track the plane, estimate distance and speed by eye, and hope the shell and the target met at the same point. The Shilka, however, was given its own eye, a radar that could detect the enemy at a distance of up to 18 kilometers. But the real magic happened inside the counting deciding device. This was a primitive forefather of modern computers, calculating target trajectories in real time while accounting for wind speed, air temperature, and even the individual wear and tear of each of the 4 barrels. The most incredible achievement was the ability to maintain precision fire while on the move. As tanks and APCs jolted over rugged terrain, the Shilka's electronics automatically compensated for every bump and tilt of the hull, keeping the guns locked onto the target. The crew had 3 operational modes for any scenario. In ideal conditions, the automation handled everything from detection to lock-on. If the enemy deployed heavy radio jamming, the operator switched to semi-automatic mode, tracking the target through an optical sight. And if the electronics failed entirely, there was always the reliable manual drive. This flexibility made the machine nearly impossible to blind with electronic warfare. It was this iron brain that turned chaotic skyward spray into the surgical elimination of any object daring to appear on its radar. The Western world suffered a genuine shock in October 1973 during the Yom Kippur War. Until that moment, Israeli pilots were considered the best in the world, and their SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses, tactics seemed flawless. When Arab Quadrant missile systems began their hunt, Israeli Skyhawks and Phantoms instinctively dove toward the deck to evade long-range radar. They expected safety at low altitudes, but instead, they plummeted into a firestorm. Hidden in the desert sands, the Shilkas were already waiting for them. The results were staggering. During the first 3 days of combat, Israel lost so many aircraft that Command issued a temporary ban on flights within the Shilka's operational zones. It turned out that 4 23mm barrels created a wall of lead so dense that dodging it was physically impossible. It was like trying to fly through a giant high-speed blender. Surviving pilots reported that the Shilka didn't just shoot down planes, it literally shredded them into pieces. That was the moment that the West realized their doctrine of low-altitude, high-speed strikes had been shattered by the Soviet anti-aircraft harvester. In the aftermath, the U.S. was forced to urgently overhaul its entire aviation doctrine, pouring massive funding into the development of the armored A-10 Thunderbolt II, a jet designed with the primary goal of surviving the Shilka's fire. The mountains of Afghanistan became the ultimate test for the Shilka, even though the Mujahideen had no air force. It seemed the anti-aircraft gun would be useless there, but instead, it became the most sought-after weapon for convoy escort. In narrow mountain passes, when ambushes struck from sheer cliffs above, conventional tanks and IFVs found themselves trapped. Their cannons simply couldn't elevate high enough to return fire, but the Shilka's barrels could snap nearly vertical, turning enemy fighting positions into dust in seconds. Terrified Mujahideen fighters nicknamed it the Zimei Goranich, the three-headed dragon, and the Shaitan Arba, the Devil's Chariot. Specifically for the Afghan theater, the machine was modernized into a version called the quote _11_____. The expensive and fragile radar system was stripped away as unnecessary, and the saved space and weight were repurposed for a massive ammunition reserve and night vision sights. Now, the bins held 4,000 rounds instead of 2,000. It was a terrifying force. The 4 barrels functioned like a giant chainsaw, shredding the boulders and mud walls behind which the enemy hid. It was in Afghanistan that the Shilka proved its small caliber wasn't a weakness, but a source of incredible flexibility. Where a heavy tank shell fired once and often missed, the Shilka flooded the area with lead, leaving the enemy zero chance of survival. The choice of the 23mm caliber had long been a point of contention. It seemed logical that a larger shell would have a better chance of downing a plane with a single hit. But Soviet mathematicians and engineers calculated differently. They realized that at low altitudes, an anti-aircraft gun has only a few seconds while the target is in sight. Heavy 37mm or 57mm guns had rates of fire that were too slow. If you missed the first shot, the enemy wouldn't give you a second. The Shilka bet on statistics. Its 4 barrels unleashed such a dense stream of lead that it created a solid cloud of shrapnel in the sky. Instead of trying to hit the plane with a single quote 12, the Shilka saturated the entire sector where the target was located. With this density of fire, the probability of a hit skyrocketed. Additionally, the 23mm shell was light enough to allow for a massive combat load of 2,000 rounds. This turned the self-propelled gun into an autonomous harvester capable of long, intense combat without needing immediate resupply. Ultimately, it was this reliance on fire density rather than single-shot power that made the Shilka the gold standard for close-quarters air defense. Over time, the more advanced and powerful Tunguska arrived, combining both cannons and missiles. It seemed the good old Shilka, with its 23mm barrels, would finally fade into history and be sent to the scrap heap. It was criticized for its short range and its inability to counter modern helicopters that had learned to fire missiles from outside its engagement zone. However, the Shilka proved to be an exceptionally resilient machine. It turned out that replacing it entirely was impossible. It was too simple, reliable, and cheap to operate compared to the over-engineered new systems. Many countries that received the Shilka during the Soviet era were in no hurry to retire it. Instead, they began a process of endless modernization. They equipped the units with modern thermal imagers, digital fire control systems, and even supplemental man-pads like the ___, quote _13_____. This allowed the old machine to ___, quote _14___ at night and strike with far greater precision. But the real secret to its longevity wasn't the electronics, it was the platform itself. The sheer volume of units produced and the abundance of spare parts made the Shilka the AK-47 of anti-aircraft guns. While newer systems required expensive maintenance and laboratory-like conditions, the Shilka continued to operate in dust, mud, and extreme temperatures, remaining a faithful guardian of the front lines. In our time, the Shilka has suddenly found a second life that no one in the 1960s could have imagined. The world has been overwhelmed by the era of drones. It turns out that modern UAVs, from tiny scouts to loitering munitions, are the perfect targets for this vintage Soviet anti-aircraft gun. Modern surface-to-air missiles often fail here. Firing a multi-million-dollar interceptor from a Tor or Patriot system at a cheap drone is like firing a golden cannon at a sparrow. Furthermore, missiles often struggle to lock onto such small, cold targets. This is where the Shilka's 23mm cannons have returned to center stage. To the Shilka, it doesn't matter how small a drone is or what it's made of. The math is simple. 4 barrels erect an impassable wall of steel and shrapnel in the sky. The cost of a single burst is dozens of times less than the price of even the most primitive drone, yet the effectiveness is colossal. The bet on insane fire rate and a cloud of lead made by engineers over half a century ago has suddenly become the key to solving the primary military challenge of the 21st century. In a new reality where the sky swarms with cheap and dangerous drones, the Shilka has transformed from a museum exhibit back into the most sought-after hunter on the battlefield. The story of the Shilka is not just a tale of old Soviet hardware. It is a vivid lesson that in warfare, pragmatism and precise calculation often mean more than raw power. In its early days, it was criticized for its small caliber, labeled unripe, and predicted to be quickly replaced. Yet, this machine became one of the most recognizable symbols of Soviet weaponry, traveling from the sands of the Sinai to the snow-capped mountains of the Caucasus and today's modern battlefields. The designers of the distant 1960s created more than just an anti-aircraft gun. They built a universal tool that managed to outlive its creators and the very era for which it was designed. The Shilka proved that a correctly chosen concept, in this case, prioritizing fire density and rate of fire, remains relevant even 60 years later. Today, as the sky teems with drones and warfare becomes increasingly high-tech, the good old anti-aircraft harvester with its 4 barrels stands as confidently as ever, reminding us that sometimes the old solutions are the most effective. The history of this machine continues, and who knows what other surprises this legendary Shaitan Arba has in store for the future.